So, Princess Anne just effectively ended Camilla's daughter's entire public existence in about 2 incredibly tense minutes. And the massive glaring part absolutely everyone is still completely missing is that Laura Lopes was highly likely set up entirely by her own mother's silence. That sounds completely insane, I know. But when you actually meticulously look at the timeline, the strict access logs, and exactly the way that Massive Hall was strategically arranged completely before anyone even spoke a word, the whole messy thing rapidly starts to look significantly less like a spontaneous family argument and infinitely more like a highly calculated delivery. And the absolute first person who understood that wasn't the frantic press, absolutely wasn't the terrified security team. It was the 76-year-old woman standing 4 feet away, calmly pretending to examine a boring display of local potatoes. Before we dive deep into the highly specific details, I just want to say if you genuinely enjoy the exact kind of story where the incredibly quiet person turns out to have been meticulously counting the entire time, take a quick second and subscribe to my channel. We aggressively break down the royal family's boring paperwork, the restricted guest lists, and the incredibly small, seemingly minor decisions that explicitly explain absolutely everything by Thursday, if anyone actually bothers to look at them. So, here is exactly what happened: the Royal Horticultural Halls in Westminster. A highly routine, boring charity showcase for rural development. Simple trestle tables, eager county producers, small jars of local honey with neat handwritten labels, a quiet man from Cumbria standing awkwardly behind a modest display of seed potatoes, desperately waiting for his 90 seconds of royal attention. Princess Anne was actively working the large room exactly the specific way she has flawlessly worked large rooms for 50 long years. Structured navy coat, simple gold brooch, incredibly tight schedule, methodically and politely moving entirely through local dignitaries, completely without absolutely ever looking exactly like she desperately wanted to be somewhere else. That specific woman has dutifully done significantly more official engagements than absolutely anyone else in that entire family, absolutely every single year for most of my adult life. And entirely in 5 long decades, there has absolutely not been a single valid complaint about her professional conduct. At exactly 1:00 p.m., Catherine was actively there too, exactly 2 stands further down the long aisle. And that specific detail matters immensely, because the Princess of Wales absolutely does not end up at a small, mundane agricultural showcase in June entirely by accident. That was a highly deliberate strategic decision, formally made weeks entirely in advance, completely by someone who explicitly wanted a highly specific photograph of exactly the 2 of them working completely together. The highly respected senior woman and the beloved future queen actively working the exact same ordinary room. There is a massive, deliberate message entirely in that specific image, and absolutely everyone completely inside the palace deeply understood exactly what it was. This massive family has completely spent 29 long years constantly, unfairly being aggressively measured exactly against one tragic absent woman, and the absolute only effective answer it has absolutely ever found is pure, unshakable continuity. An older, respected woman who has absolutely never, ever put a single foot wrong, proudly standing directly beside a younger, beloved one the country has definitively decided it trusts. Diana's long shadow is the absolute only reason that specific orchestrated image exists entirely at all. Somebody highly observant, completely outside the palace, completely understood it too. The press reporters were the highly usual, incredibly small pool. Exactly 2 tired regional papers, exactly 1 standard wire photographer, exactly 1 small broadcast crew doing B-roll pictures completely without sound, and exactly 1 highly unusual freelance photographer completely with a massive long lens standing incredibly quietly exactly at the absolute very back, completely on the diagonal. That highly specific physical position matters immensely because it was literally the absolute only spot entirely in that massive crowded hall, completely from which you can perfectly see the exact faces of exactly two people actively standing exactly at the third stand along. He had absolutely been firmly planted exactly there completely since the very moment the heavy doors opened. Hold firmly onto that specific detail because I am absolutely coming completely back to him, and it is absolutely not pleasant. At exactly about 1:20 p.m., Laura Lopes confidently came entirely in, completely through a highly restricted side entrance. Camilla's civilian daughter, married name Lopes, 2 children, a quiet career in the art world, a woman who has completely spent her entire adult life actively being politely photographed exactly twice a year, and absolutely otherwise leaving entirely no public trace completely at all. Absolutely nobody entirely in that massive hall was actively expecting her, precisely because she was absolutely not on the highly restricted working list entirely for the afternoon session, and legally had absolutely no business whatsoever actively being absolutely anywhere near a highly restricted floor. She aggressively came completely through the thick crowd entirely without stopping once, which explicitly tells you she intimately knew exactly, precisely where she was aggressively going, and she stopped exactly about 6 feet directly behind Catherine. She patiently waited entirely for a tiny gap entirely in the polite conversation. She finally got exactly one, and then she aggressively stepped directly forward. Absolutely no polite curtsy, absolutely no formal greeting, absolutely no respectful dropping entirely of her voice, which is exactly what absolutely everyone automatically, instinctively does, entirely, in a massive room exactly like that. Absolutely, even exactly when they are furious, precisely because the loud acoustics completely under a massive glass roof effortlessly carry a quiet whisper 20 feet. Exactly 4 completely separate, unconnected people were physically close enough entirely to clearly hear it. She aggressively, loudly told Catherine that the highly recent, massive changes entirely to the royal estate funding had completely been a highly deliberate, vicious insult entirely to her family, and exactly that. Absolutely everyone actively involved completely knew exactly what they were maliciously doing. Now abruptly stop and critically look entirely at exactly what that specific action truly is, because the lazy press coverage has aggressively spent an entire week simply calling it an outburst, and it was absolutely nothing entirely of the kind. An emotional outburst actively happens entirely in a quiet corridor or a dark car park, or entirely at the absolute end entirely of a tense lunch, exactly when exactly 2 people awkwardly meet completely by pure accident, and exactly one has finally had completely enough. A spontaneous outburst absolutely does not strictly require a restricted side entrance, a specific name illegally added entirely to a highly restrictive list, and exactly one freelance photographer perfectly standing entirely on the exact diagonal completely at the absolute back entirely of the hall. Since 1:10 p.m., a civilian woman who was explicitly barred entirely from that specific guest list confidently walked directly into a highly public engagement and aggressively, loudly raised a highly private, toxic family money grievance directly in front entirely of the national press. That is absolutely not mere temper. That is a highly calculated, malicious delivery. Catherine absolutely did not answer her. Absolutely everyone physically present has completely been incredibly, uniformly clear entirely about exactly that. And having exhaustively watched 14 long years entirely of that specific woman operating completely in public, it would have absolutely astonished me entirely if she ever had. She has absolutely never, ever exactly once generously given a hostel room exactly what it eagerly came completely for. She calmly took exactly half a step backward, rigidly kept her face completely, flawlessly still, and looked coldly exactly at Laura Lopes. Exactly the highly specific, chilling way you deeply look entirely at exactly a person who has absolutely just incredibly stupidly done exactly something they absolutely cannot ever take completely back. The quiet man, completely from Cumbria, was absolutely still awkwardly holding a potato, and then Princess Anne, standing exactly 4 feet entirely to the left, slowly turned completely round. She absolutely did not quickly turn straight away, which is the exact, specific detail absolutely every single terrified witness has prominently mentioned, and the absolute reason this entire story exists entirely at all. She methodically, calmly adjusted her leather gloves entirely first. Exactly one, then exactly the other, methodically pulling the stiff cuff firmly down, exactly at the wrist, exactly the specific way she has flawlessly done entirely in 1,000 public photographs. Then she stood completely, terrifyingly still entirely for exactly about 3 agonizing seconds. 3 full seconds is an incredibly, terrifyingly very long time, completely in a massive room entirely with 200 noisy people completely in it. Long exactly enough entirely for the buzzing conversation completely, at the absolute far end entirely to completely die, completely out entirely on its own. Long exactly enough entirely for a bored broadcast operator entirely to sharply swing a massive camera completely around entirely without ever being told. Exactly, someone vividly said, you could clearly hear the quiet rain lightly hitting the massive glass roof. And I absolutely believe it precisely because that is precisely exactly what a massive hall exactly like that vividly sounds exactly like entirely when absolutely everyone violently stops talking exactly at the exact same moment. Then she slowly turned and coldly faced the angry woman. Absolutely no hot anger entirely in it. That is the exact thing normal people find incredibly hard entirely to believe, and exactly the specific thing exactly that absolutely made the massive maneuver flawlessly work. Her stern expression absolutely did not change entirely at all, and she absolutely did not ever answer the loud accusation. That is the absolute masterful move, and it is incredibly worth slowing completely down entirely on, precisely because it is the absolute most incredibly surgical, devastating thing absolutely anyone has ever actively done completely in public entirely in that massive family entirely in 20 years. Laura Lopes had aggressively come entirely into exactly that massive hall, completely with a highly specific toxic grievance, entirely about massive money and sprawling estates and perceived unfair family treatment. And absolutely every single loud syllable was explicitly designed entirely to aggressively be answered, precisely because an angry answer instantly makes it a highly public dispute, and a highly public dispute inherently has exactly 2 valid sides, and exactly 2 valid sides can easily be aggressively reported by the eager tabloids. Princess Anne absolutely did not ever give her exactly a side. She coldly asked entirely, in a perfectly ordinary, chillingly flat voice, exactly whether the highly trained security team had explicitly checked the highly restricted guest list entirely for the afternoon session. That was the absolute, entire, devastating reply. Absolutely not exactly one single word entirely about the disputed funding. Absolutely not exactly one single word entirely about the sprawling family or the massive estates or the perceived insult. Exactly one devastating question entirely to the massive room, absolutely, rather than directly to the angry woman, entirely about exactly whether exactly that specific person was legally supposed entirely to be physically standing exactly there entirely at all. She absolutely did not argue completely with exactly what Laura loudly said. She coldly, publicly queried her absolute legal right entirely to be physically inside the massive building. I have obsessively watched exactly that specific leaked clip significantly more times entirely that is remotely healthy, and it absolutely still actively makes me visibly wince. Absolutely anyone can easily lose a petty argument. Actively being loudly told entirely in front, entirely of the ravenous national press, exactly that the absolute real, massive question is exactly how you illegally got completely past the front door is exactly a completely different order entirely of thing entirely, and it absolutely does not easily wash completely off. This is exactly the specific point entirely where Laura Lopes tragically made her massive second mistake, which was infinitely, significantly much larger entirely than the absolute first. She absolutely should have quietly gone. Absolutely any highly paid advisor completely in that massive building would instantly have urgently told her entirely to weakly smile, politely apologize profusely entirely for the clumsy intrusion, and quickly walk completely out entirely through the exact same restricted side door she illegally came entirely in by. By that Thursday, it would inevitably have been exactly a tiny, forgotten paragraph completely in the back pages. She aggressively stepped significantly closer, entirely, instead. Horrified witnesses vividly described her exactly as having incredibly gone, significantly very red entirely by exactly that tense stage. She loudly, aggressively told the formidable Princess Royal exactly that. She was cowardly hiding completely behind highly outdated, ridiculous protocol. She loudly said exactly that the massive financial audit currently aggressively running completely across the sprawling royal estates was actively being highly deliberately driven entirely to maliciously damage her specific family. And she incredibly loudly said exactly that. Absolutely everyone completely in exactly that massive palace intimately knew entirely about the highly private secret meetings exactly that had completely been actively taking place entirely with the powerful Prince of Wales. That absolute last explosive accusation, incredibly loudly carried completely across the highly polished floor, entirely to the absolute back entirely of the massive hall, exactly where the eager reporters were quietly standing, and exactly 3 entirely of them frantically went completely for their notebooks exactly at the exact same time. Let me quickly explain the massive audit, because absolutely everything entirely in this explosive story fundamentally hangs completely off it. A highly formal royal estate audit absolutely has completely nothing whatsoever entirely to do completely with anyone's personal handbag. It is a highly rigorous, strict, line-by-line, massive reconciliation entirely of exactly what a massive estate actually spent exactly against exactly what it was explicitly, legally authorized entirely to actually spend, running exhaustively, completely back for long years. And it explicitly catches exactly 2 highly specific things. Massive money, exactly that silently went completely out, entirely, with absolutely no legal paperwork completely behind it, and exactly people, exactly who were actively being highly paid, entirely for vague work. Absolutely nobody can physically produce any concrete evidence entirely of. An official audit absolutely does not actively accuse absolutely anyone entirely of absolutely anything. It simply produces a highly detailed, massive list entirely of specific items exactly that strictly require a highly detailed explanation, and then it immediately becomes exactly someone's highly stressful job entirely to explicitly explain them. Absolutely someone entirely in that massive family had completely been explicitly told entirely to fully expect exactly that specific damning list. And the loud camera shutter had completely been frantically going the absolute entire agonizing time. That highly specific freelance completely at the absolute back entirely with the massive long lens had actively been frantically firing completely since the absolute exact moment Laura aggressively stepped completely forward. And entirely in a massive hall completely with a massive glass roof and a cold stone floor, the incredibly loud sound entirely of a massive professional body aggressively firing exactly at 8 loud frames entirely a second is absolutely not subtle at all. Exactly 2 people quietly standing entirely near him clearly said the exact same thing. He absolutely did not ever move his physical position exactly once. He absolutely did not frantically swing completely around entirely to blindly find the perfect shot. He was completely, already perfectly, exactly on it. A normal photographer absolutely does not ever get exactly that incredibly lucky. A highly specific photographer explicitly gets told exactly where to stand. Princess Anne absolutely did not raise her flat voice entirely at absolutely any point. She simply, coldly, lifted exactly one gloved hand, exactly about 6 inches, which is exactly the highly specific, subtle signal her highly trained protection officer has completely been flawlessly reading entirely for 30 long years. And the massive silent man aggressively came completely through the shocked crowd, entirely without ever hurrying, and coldly, firmly asked Laura entirely to physically step completely out, entirely to the massive lobby, and coldly told her exactly that her specific unauthorized presence exactly at the restricted event was absolutely no longer entirely appropriate. The absolute entire explosive thing, completely from the very first angry sentence entirely to the heavy closing doors, actively ran completely under exactly 2 minutes. Exactly 2 minutes. And it exhaustingly took exactly a full fortnight entirely of massive institutional machinery completely to furiously deal entirely with, precisely because exactly here is exactly what absolutely everyone entirely in that massive room intimately understood completely by the exact time they finally got completely to their cars. That was absolutely not a messy family argument exactly that accidentally happened entirely to simply occur completely in public. That was exactly a highly toxic family argument, highly deliberately staged, completely in public, explicitly in front, entirely of a highly specific photographer, exactly who was mysteriously booked, exactly at a highly restricted event, exactly where the absolute 2 most highly protected women completely in that massive institution were exactly standing 8 feet apart, completely on the exact specific week, exactly that a massive, terrifying financial audit was actively moving exactly it entirely to the specific part, exactly where absolutely someone would finally have entirely to actually start explicitly explaining things. And the absolute very first panicked question exactly that frantically went completely round the long corridors entirely of that massive palace was absolutely not entirely about the angry words entirely at all. It was intensely exactly how she illegally got entirely in. Security completely at the massive front entirely of that highly secure building was incredibly tight. A highly accredited, vetted list, strictly printed, unforgeable badges, a massive, rigorous checkpoint exactly at the main entrance, entirely staffed completely by highly serious people, exactly who routinely, actively turn completely away powerful peers entirely of the realm, absolutely without even blinking exactly if the specific name is absolutely not exactly on the official sheet. The terrified staff immediately went completely to the digital access logs exactly that highly tense evening, and exactly what they quickly found actively took exactly about 11 terrifying minutes. A highly restricted VIP invitation had actively been quietly issued entirely locally, absolutely not completely by the massive palace, absolutely not completely by the formal household, absolutely not entirely through absolutely any, entirely of the 4 strict offices exactly, that are explicitly supposed entirely to legally sign, completely off on attendance, exactly at a restricted event, completely with exactly 2 senior working royals, physically entirely in the room. It entirely came directly from the highly regional director, entirely of the specific organization actively hosting the massive showcase, a highly quiet man, completely in his late 60s, completely with an incredibly long, deep connection, entirely to exactly that specific part, entirely of the country, and exactly a highly distant, quiet social acquaintance, completely with Camilla's specific family, heavily going completely back for long years. He had quietly been explicitly asked incredibly late, exactly as a highly personal favor, entirely to illegally add exactly one more restricted name completely to the highly restrictive list entirely by hand. He was completely, unceremoniously suspended completely before nightfall. The highly illegal invitation was officially logged exactly as a massive Tier 1 accreditation breach, which completely in exactly that highly secure world is undeniably the absolute most highly serious catastrophic category, exactly there absolutely is. The exact specific one explicitly reserved entirely for exactly a massive failure, exactly that aggressively put exactly a highly protected person completely in exactly a room, entirely with exactly someone absolutely nobody had properly checked, and entirely in the absolute middle entirely of absolutely all entirely of that massive chaos, completely on a highly secure conference call entirely somewhere else, completely entirely, the powerful Prince of Wales was quietly, factually told exactly what had shockingly happened. He abruptly ended the massive call completely mid-sentence. The stunned people entirely on the absolute other end clearly described exactly that, exactly as the absolute single most incredibly out-of-character thing exactly that specific man has absolutely ever actively done completely in public life. He absolutely does not actively do exactly that. He is undeniably the absolute most incredibly procedurally polite person completely in that massive institution. Exactly a man, exactly who formally thanks exactly a massive room completely before he finally leaves it, absolutely even exactly when the massive room has incredibly wasted exactly a full hour entirely of his valuable time. I urgently want you entirely to deeply understand exactly what he was intensely looking exactly at, completely on exactly that secure screen, precisely because it was absolutely not a mere security lapse. He was coldly watching exactly a highly protected woman actively get aggressively approached completely in public, explicitly in front entirely of a mysteriously booked photographer, entirely by exactly someone directly connected entirely to a highly toxic family, completely with a massive financial grievance, completely on exactly a specific week, exactly when the hungry press had completely been incredibly quietly, maliciously primed. He has painfully, repeatedly seen exactly that exact same toxic sequence relentlessly run completely before, entirely on Diana, completely across absolutely most entirely of his traumatized childhood, and it horribly finished exactly the tragic way it inevitably finished. He coldly put the secure phone completely down, firmly told his highly loyal chief of staff entirely to aggressively get the absolute raw, completely unedited full footage completely from the highly suspicious freelance, and made it incredibly terrifyingly clear exactly that the absolute price absolutely did not matter at all. Absolutely not exactly the curated pictures exactly that had completely already actively gone completely out. The massive, raw, unedited digital card. Absolutely everything completely before and entirely after the specific frames exactly that were actively going entirely to inevitably run, because exactly what actually happens entirely in the highly critical 90 seconds completely before exactly a specific person aggressively steps completely forward clearly tells you exactly whether they were merely walking innocently or exactly whether they were actively, maliciously waiting. That highly specific instruction clearly tells you exactly what he was actively doing, which was absolutely not mere damage control. A panicked man, desperately handling exactly a messy public relations problem, frantically asks entirely for the published images and urgently demands a slick line entirely to give the ravenous press. A highly furious man exactly who coldly asks entirely for the absolute raw, unedited digital card is aggressively building exactly a massive, permanent legal file. He silently watched it completely in his highly secure office completely with the bright lights firmly off. The quiet people exactly who were physically entirely in that massive building clearly described the heavy atmosphere completely in exactly one chilling word, and the specific word is exactly cold. Absolutely not loud shouting, absolutely not violently slamming doors, pure cold. He quietly sat and coldly watched exactly a civilian woman aggressively cross exactly a massive hall entirely toward his heavily protected wife. And he coldly watched exactly the stunned crowd react, and he coldly watched exactly the absolute exact precise moment his formidable aunt slowly turned completely round. When it finally finished, he absolutely did not say absolutely anything entirely for a very long while. Then he quietly picked completely up the highly secure, encrypted line entirely to his father. He absolutely did not politely ask for any permission. That is exactly the massive part, exactly that truly matters. And absolutely everyone, completely and absolutely both massive households, acutely noticed it. He calmly, factually briefed the tired king completely on exactly what had explosively happened, completely on exactly how she had illegally got completely in, completely on exactly what it was absolutely going entirely to exactly look completely like entirely in the brutal morning papers. And exactly that, he firmly told him exactly that he was actively taking the massive disciplinary process entirely on himself. The quiet king simply listened. He absolutely did not argue. He simply told his heir entirely to aggressively do absolutely whatever was completely necessary, entirely to fiercely protect the massive institution. I eagerly want entirely to sit completely on exactly that brief exchange entirely for exactly a quick second, precisely because there is exactly a whole, massive reign contained entirely inside exactly it. A tired man entirely in his late 70s, highly unwell, currently married entirely to exactly a highly controversial woman, exactly whose civilian daughter had incredibly walked completely into exactly a highly public engagement and aggressively gone entirely at his absolute own son's highly popular wife, smoothly handing his absolute own son the absolute complete authority entirely to aggressively deal completely with it and completely permanently staying entirely out entirely of the messy room. He absolutely did not actively defend absolutely anyone. He absolutely did not desperately ask entirely for more time. He intimately knew exactly what he had completely been handed, and he calmly handed it completely straight entirely on. William aggressively went entirely into the highly secure basement briefing room exactly at 6 minutes exactly past 5, completely without even taking his heavy coat entirely off. Exactly 5 highly senior aides were completely already actively sitting entirely there, absolutely each completely with a heavy folder directly in front, entirely of them containing exactly a highly sanitized version, entirely of the explosive day, written completely from absolutely whichever direction they had nervously watched it. He confidently walked entirely to the absolute middle entirely of the massive mahogany table, coldly put his secure phone completely down entirely on it, exactly hard enough entirely to be loudly heard, and coldly picked completely up the remote. He aggressively played the massive raw footage completely on the large wall. Absolutely nobody said exactly a single word exactly while it actively ran. The loud, aggressive camera shutter is perfectly audible, completely on the raw audio, which is exactly the highly specific damning detail exactly that permanently finished the massive argument completely before absolutely anyone even made it. And the incredibly loud, aggressive sound entirely of a massive professional camera, violently firing exactly at 8 loud frames, entirely a second, completely filled exactly that quiet briefing room entirely for exactly about 40 agonizing seconds. He coldly turned the bright projector completely off. Then he coldly asked the absolute only single question he had actually come completely there entirely to aggressively ask, which was exactly how exactly a highly controversial civilian woman, exactly who had completely been actively kept entirely off the highly restricted working list entirely for the absolute better part entirely of a full year, had incredibly, illegally walked completely into exactly a highly secured hall, actively containing exactly 2 highly protected senior working royals. He intensely looked exactly at the terrified director entirely of security, exactly while he coldly asked it. The panicked man frantically began exactly a messy explanation. William brutally stopped him exactly about 6 terrified words entirely in, and coldly said he absolutely did not ever want exactly an explanation. He absolutely wanted exactly a specific name. He aggressively wanted the specific person exactly who had completely made it physically possible, explicitly identified entirely in exactly that highly secure room entirely that very evening, and he aggressively wanted them completely out, entirely of their lucrative post, completely off the highly restricted premises, and heavily, formally reminded, completely in harsh writing, entirely of exactly what they had legally signed, completely before the very first newspaper edition even landed. This is exactly where it permanently stops, absolutely being simply about exactly one messy afternoon entirely in Westminster, precisely because exactly that is absolutely not exactly how exactly a highly powerful man behaves, entirely about a simple minor security lapse, entirely at a boring flower show. He had aggressively spent the absolute previous exactly 2 months incredibly quietly, ruthlessly working completely through the massive households, actively moving highly connected people completely out entirely of key positions, aggressively closing completely off the highly informal, toxic back channels exactly that have seamlessly run completely through exactly that massive building entirely for 20 long years. Absolutely everyone, highly senior, completely in exactly that massive palace, intimately knew it was actively happening, and absolutely most entirely of them had desperately decided entirely to quietly keep their heads firmly down exactly until it was finally finished. That explosive afternoon clearly told him it was absolutely not completely finished. And exactly that, absolutely whatever he had completely been actively clearing completely out, absolutely still had exactly a highly active hand completely on a vital door. Exactly one entirely of the terrified aides desperately tried entirely to weakly place the massive blame exactly at a safe distance. The highly illegal invitation had supposedly come entirely from exactly a minor regional branch, he weakly said, an entirely outside organization, absolutely not the massive royal household. William coldly asked him exactly whether exactly that specific minor regional branch had completely been explicitly, formally briefed completely on the highly strict standing arrangements exactly regarding Camilla's highly controversial family. The terrified aide slowly nodded, precisely because it absolutely had. He coldly asked exactly why the strict briefing had completely been utterly ignored. The panicked man nervously moved entirely in his chair and weakly said there had completely been intense pressure, entirely from significantly high above. William coldly asked entirely for a specific name. The highly tense room went completely, utterly quiet. Absolutely nobody entirely in it said absolutely anything entirely at all. Then he aggressively reached entirely for a heavy folder, exactly that had completely been actively sitting entirely on the mahogany table, completely since entirely before he even came completely in. It had exactly a highly restricted red tag, strictly limited circulation, and exactly a title completely on the front, exactly that clearly tells you significantly more entirely about the highly toxic state entirely of exactly that massive institution, entirely than absolutely anything else, completely in this entire story. Internal influences. Absolutely somebody completely in exactly that massive building meticulously keeps exactly a highly updated, massive list entirely of the highly informal, toxic relationships exactly that actively cut entirely across the highly rigid official structure. Quiet marriages, highly obscure old jobs, distant cousins, exactly a highly placed junior manager, entirely in exactly one busy office, directly related entirely to a highly senior assistant completely in another. It is absolutely not exactly a messy tabloid scandal document. Absolutely every single massive, complex organization has exactly a sanitized version entirely of it. And completely in exactly that specific one, it legally exists precisely because the highly rigid official chart has absolutely never, ever exactly once accurately described exactly how absolutely anything actually gets completely done. It quickly took him entirely under exactly a single minute, entirely, to flawlessly find exactly a damning connection. A highly placed, mid-level manager, entirely in the massive palace administration, completely quietly married, entirely to a highly connected personal assistant, actively working completely inside Camilla's highly private household. He violently closed the heavy folder, looked intensely exactly at the terrified director entirely of security, and coldly said exactly one single, devastating sentence. Entirely within exactly 20 short minutes, the specific man was actively walking completely out, entirely through the highly restricted back gates, completely with exactly two large, silent security officers physically directly beside him, actively carrying absolutely nothing at all. Exactly at 5:30, entirely in the busy afternoon, directly past stunned people he had actively worked completely with entirely for 11 long years. The massive, undeniable message immediately went completely round, exactly that entire building, significantly faster, entirely than absolutely any typed memo has absolutely ever traveled entirely in it. The powerful Prince of Wales had completely, permanently stopped exactly being the patient heir, exactly who would simply passively deal completely with absolutely all entirely of this eventually. He was aggressively, ruthlessly dealing completely with it exactly now. Exactly while absolutely all entirely of exactly that was actively moving entirely in a secure basement entirely in London, Princess Anne was quietly sitting completely in the quiet back entirely of a highly secure car. She absolutely did not ever use her phone. She absolutely did not ever speak entirely to her trusted aide. She simply sat quietly completely with her hands neatly folded entirely on her simple bag and intensely looked completely straight ahead entirely through absolutely most entirely of the long drive. The specific person completely in exactly that quiet car, completely with her later, clearly said she was absolutely not visibly upset entirely in absolutely any way exactly that publicly showed. She was meticulously, ruthlessly going completely back entirely through absolutely every single detail entirely of it. The exact, precise timing entirely of the highly illegal entry, the highly specific tiny gap entirely in the polite conversation the angry woman had patiently waited entirely for, the exact, highly specific wording she had explicitly used, and the absolute exact order she had explicitly used it completely in, the exact, highly suspicious physical position entirely of the massive cameras exactly when it initially started. Strict protocol absolutely does not ever exactly mean mere manners entirely to exactly that specific woman. Absolute protocol is undeniably the massive structural load-bearing wall entirely of the absolute entire ancient building. Absolutely every single rigid rule entirely about exactly who stands exactly where and exactly who is exactly on exactly which restricted list officially exists precisely because 200 long years ago, absolutely someone astutely worked completely out exactly that. The absolute only thing fundamentally separating exactly a massive monarchy completely from exactly a highly permanent bloody argument is exactly a highly rigid written order entirely of strict precedence, exactly that. Absolutely nobody is absolutely ever legally allowed entirely to simply improvise casually around. She finally spoke, and it was entirely to coldly ask exactly about the highly specific regional director, exactly who had illegally issued the massive invitation. Absolutely not entirely about Laura, absolutely not entirely about her mother, purely about the specific man exactly at the restricted door. Security absolutely always starts entirely at the absolute front entrance, she coldly said. And exactly that was the absolute entire complete comment. Now there is exactly a massive, terrifying question entirely underneath absolutely all entirely of this exactly that literally took me exactly 2 full days entirely to finally work completely out, and exactly once I clearly saw it, I absolutely could completely not ever unsee it. Princess Anne easily could have instantly stopped exactly that highly public confrontation entirely in exactly about 4 short seconds. She constantly has exactly a massive, highly trained protection officer securely standing exactly 8 feet completely away entirely at absolutely all times. She possesses exactly 50 long years entirely of massive, unquestioned authority, completely in exactly any room, exactly one slightly raised hand exactly at the very first angry sentence, and exactly that angry woman is physically entirely in the quiet lobby, completely before the very second sentence completely leaves her furious mouth, and absolutely nobody entirely in the massive press pool ever gets significantly more entirely than exactly a blurry frame and exactly a messy, unconfirmed rumor. She deliberately, highly calculatedly let it completely run. She calmly stood exactly there and deliberately let an angry woman clearly say exactly 3 full, highly damning sentences completely in front, entirely of exactly 24 hungry reporters, and absolutely only finally moved exactly when the absolute last, entirely of them, was entirely out. This is exactly my highly specific reading, absolutely, rather than absolutely anyone's fully confirmed official account. And I will clearly say exactly that exactly once, and then quietly get completely out entirely of the way. I absolutely do completely not ever think she momentarily froze, and I absolutely do completely not ever think she was simply gathering herself. I firmly, deeply think she aggressively wanted entirely to clearly hear the absolute whole massive thing entirely in public, completely with highly credible witnesses and exactly a high-definition recording actively running, precisely because exactly a toxic grievance aggressively shouted entirely in a quiet corridor is completely deniable, and exactly a toxic grievance aggressively delivered completely in front entirely of the national press is absolute ironclad evidence entirely of a highly specific toxic state entirely of mind. She deliberately, coldly, let the highly angry woman completely finish actively building the massive legal case entirely against absolutely herself. Then entirely in the quiet car, she coldly asked her trusted aide entirely for the full, detailed attendance list. Absolutely not the highly curated, accredited press list, the absolute full, highly detailed attendance list entirely for the entire afternoon session. The highly specific one exactly, that fully includes absolutely all local guests and highly specific organizational invitations, hastily printed completely out, entirely on the long way, completely back, precisely because the trusted aide already had it completely on a secure tablet. There were exactly 3 highly specific names completely on it, exactly that she instantly, chillingly recognized completely immediately. Exactly 3 highly specific regional journalists, absolutely none, entirely of them actively from the highly vetted main royal pool, absolutely all 3 entirely of them completely with exactly an incredibly long and highly friendly, cozy relationship, completely with highly connected people, completely around Camilla's specific family, and absolutely all 3 entirely of them conspicuously standing exactly in a massive hall, entirely in Westminster, completely on a random Tuesday afternoon, entirely for exactly a highly obscure rural development showcase, exactly that would normally, absolutely only ever be incredibly lightly covered entirely by exactly one board wire photographer and exactly a local stringer. That is the absolute exact moment it permanently stopped, entirely being exactly an isolated incident. Exactly 3 highly friendly placed journalists, exactly 1 suspicious freelance completely on the exact diagonal, completely with a massive long lens, exactly 1 highly unauthorized name, explicitly added entirely to exactly a highly restricted list, entirely by hand, exactly at the absolute very last minute, and exactly a highly angry civilian woman, exactly who confidently walked completely in, entirely through exactly a restricted side door, and aggressively went directly entirely to exactly the highly specific third stand directly along. Absolutely none entirely of exactly that is mere spontaneous temper. Absolutely all entirely of exactly, it is a highly coordinated, incredibly malicious schedule. Princess Anne had completely been the highly specific active target entirely of exactly the toxic thing, exactly that aggressively produced it entirely for long months. She had already aggressively, successfully blocked exactly two separate massive attempts entirely to quietly change the highly strict management rules completely on highly lucrative estate properties. She had forcefully, rigidly insisted completely on exactly a massive, full forensic audit, absolutely rather than exactly the highly superficial, light review, exactly, that had initially been smoothly proposed. Absolutely every single time, absolutely someone completely in exactly that highly ambitious orbit had actively tried entirely to quietly loosen exactly a strict rule, entirely about exactly how the massive, lucrative land is actively run and exactly who massively benefits completely from it. Exactly the exact same formidable woman had completely been unyieldingly standing entirely in the quiet corridor, completely with the absolute original binding documents firmly in her absolute hand. Highly ambitious people exactly who aggressively spend long years desperately trying entirely to quietly move exactly a massive wall, absolutely eventually, inevitably decide entirely to maliciously move exactly the specific person, stubbornly leaning completely against it entirely instead.